Cheryl Robertson, Terry Grenier, Megan Gardner, Lori Osher, and myself. And the first item is marijuana ordinance review of planning board comments and draft language.
I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah. Give me just a second. Happens every time. Here we go. Here we go. So we wanted to take just a minute for Kyle to, at the very highest level, recap the ordinance in case there were people who have not been paying attention to the last several months of work.
Sure. So, right, in general, the ordinance, the land use ordinance side of things, kind of splits things into 4 different land uses: the marijuana retail stores, cultivation facilities, testing facilities, and manufacturing facilities. The goal was to, in our land use ordinance, combine the uses to include both medical and adult use, since from a land use perspective, it's the impact on the ground is pretty much the same thing as far as the types of impacts or nuisances or performance standards, created around it. It's all pretty similar. So we defined, each of these uses as both the medical and adult use side of things. As for, the zoning, retail stores would be in the commercial 1, potentially on, the Stillwater Ave area, by the shopping center, or in the C2 area, specifically along Park Street. We have a few other C2 areas, zoned around town. This would be limited to just Park Street though. Cultivation, the larger scale cultivation facilities would be allowed in the commercial 1 and economic development zones, as those are more manufacturing, warehousing, industrial type uses. That's where those uses usually go in those 2 districts. The forest and agriculture is more meant for small scale commercial, small scale cultivation facilities. For instance, if a registered caregiver lived in town and they wanted to grow their, their allowed amount of 30 mature plants, they could use some space in the forest and agriculture district to do that without having to use, a really large facility or rent that space. Testing and manufacturing are treated pretty much the same way, both allowed in the commercial 1 and economic development zones. So some of the things, we looked at, design standards, limiting the distance between the marijuana facilities and existing uses. We looked at buffering, security, odor, lighting, signage, although a lot of that's, a lot of this is touched on in the state law, but some of what we talked about is, since there's 2 laws, there's the medical side and the adult use side, some of it is more fleshed out, it seems, on the adult use side. So there are a few things that are probably redundant in our ordinance on the adult use side, but we wanted to make sure that they were in there and covered both the adult use establishments as well as the medical establishments. So the planning board had its public hearing on the ordinance in February. There were no public comments made. The conversation with the board the only recommendations that they had was we had a standard for the marijuana retail stores that talked about those uses not being allowed as an accessory use to a non-marijuana related business or use or as a home occupation. So, and someone couldn't come apply for a home business permit with their business being, bringing people to their home to sell marijuana. So the board recommended, though, that standard of these marijuana establishments not being allowed to be accessory uses, really requiring them to be the principal sole use of the lot and not allowing them as home occupations. They wanted that across the board for each different type of establishment. So it's not as much of an issue with the other uses because the commercial one and EDZ don't have as many residential areas. So there aren't a lot of opportunities for, home businesses in those districts. And also having a state licensed marijuana manufacturing establishment would probably be pretty difficult to get that license, in a, residential dwelling unit. But again, I put it in there, just copied and pasted that one into each different establishment section because it seemed pretty harmless and there was really no negative impact of putting it in there and just having it there to make sure. The second comment was just clarifying small change to the language. It's actually, I wrote it down wrong in the memo. It's section 29-46. So just clarifying that the license is revocable and not the establishment itself. Aside from that, there was a little conversation about the cultivation facilities in the Forest and Agriculture District only being 500 square feet, and that number seems small. But kind of what I said before about, I mentioned to the planning board that the whole point of that was to give smaller spaces for caregivers or those types of growing operations. It was meant to give space for them where they didn't have to construct an actual structure or facility. It allowed them to have a small outdoor space for growing, kind of those tier 1 level cultivation facilities where you're only allowed to grow the 30 plant, 500 square foot plant canopy type operation. So the board didn't really recommend any changes after that discussion. So
Kyle, can I ask you a question on the revocable license?
yes.
Is there I just kind of noted on mine that said, is there a time limit on that license? Is it indefinite? Is it until the violation is corrected? Is there some kind of that I missed somewhere? So if your license is revoked because you're not in compliance, is there a way to get your license back, or how do you see that working?
Not sure entirely. I think I took this language directly from our Victualers language, Victualers license section. So I'd have to get back to you with a more formal answer.
I was just curious if I had missed something, or how long that license would be revoked.
So I can tell you, Cheryl, that council has to be really careful when they revoke licenses. There would be a process to go through, and you have to show cause, and you can't limit taking away a business license. It has to the punishment needs to fit the crime, if that makes any sense.
So this would come after, I'm assuming, warnings, and you need to be in compliance, and things like that. And then after that didn't happen, then the license would go into like a revocation kind of situation?
So if this hit my desk, that's exactly what we would do. It would start with staff. It would move to my desk. I would give a warning. If it didn't get corrected, it would go before town council. Town council would likely have to give a warning in a reasonable period to correct it. And then you kind of start all over. But you're taking away somebody's right to make money. So you got to be really careful about that.
Yes, that was my question, was how that process worked.
Aren't these licenses
Okay.
only, excuse me, only 1-year licenses anyway? So if it was in this process, you could just say, when it came up for renewal, because of these violations, we're not going to renew the license.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
The other question I had, Kyle, was the accessory use or home occupation on cultivation, especially in the F&A.
Mhm.
I would assume that people that have 15 or 20 acres that want to have an outdoor grow, that would be an accessory use, right?
Right, so I think there is an exemption for that in there. Okay, so marijuana cultivation facilities shall not operate as an accessory use to a non-marijuana related use unless in the forest and agriculture district. So that's the only one that made that clarification.
Okay, thanks.
Because yeah, it would make sense that there could be, a single family home on a large lot and, a registered caregiver in town wants to rent part of that, some space on a lot there to have their plants grow.
Yep. Great, thank you.
Sophie, I don't know if you wanted to go over these or do you want me to?
Either way, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I can, it doesn't matter. So, I guess Tom he had sent these comments in since he couldn't be here. The first one, we do have a design standard for the retail stores that say in there that talks about it being a maximum for new retail stores going into new buildings, new construction, that there's a maximum of 10,000 square feet of floor area for the retail store. And Tom's comment was that seemed like a large size. And I would agree that 10,000 square feet for a retail store does seem pretty large. I think I put this in there originally because we have a similar standard existing already for the village commercial and commercial too, just in general, not related to marijuana, just all new buildings going into the village commercial and commercial too, I think can't be more than 15,000 square foot footprint. That's in our existing ordinance design standards. So this was meant as something similar to that, and also as another mechanism to not allow retail stores to, since we consider under this proposed ordinance marijuana dispensaries in the same kind of classification as the adult use retail stores, and those uses sometimes have cultivation areas. This was sort of another way to limit the potential area that could be used for cultivating. But at the same time, we kind of already say in the ordinance that any dispensary cultivation area will be considered a cultivation facility and therefore would only be allowed in the C1 and EDZ districts. So that was kind of the reason for it being there. It's obviously open for discussion. The number could be reduced. The standard could be gotten rid of altogether. I don't know if there are any thoughts or feedback on that.
Kyle, I'm very bad with square footage. Could you tell me, is it bigger than McDonald's?
I would say yes.
Okay.
I can do a quick, if there's any other conversation, I can do a quick estimate of like a building that everyone's aware of for reference.
I feel like one time we had this discussion, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but I thought maybe that someone pointed out the Friend and Friend building as a possible size comparison. I don't know. I might be misremembering that. I kind of agree with Tom. I mean, he's made that comment before. It does seem pretty large, but I guess my other concern would be making special square footage accommodations for one particular, singling out one particular kind of business for square footage recommendations for, I don't know, without a specific reason to do so, I guess. If that is the standard in the village commercial and the C2, I'd have to hear a pretty pressing reason to give a special square footage limitation for one particular kind of business, I guess.
So a couple of things. One, Cindy, I just measured the floor area of the Burger King by the shopping center. That's about 2,500 square feet, it looks like, roughly. And to your point, Megan, yeah, the C2 village commercial 15,000 square foot max is more of a form standard. It's meant overall for any business, and it's to kind of limit those districts to smaller scale commercial operations instead of, warehouses and manufacturing facilities, the larger scale. So yeah, it's not specific to any individual use. It's just saying in general, we want this area to be smaller structures, more of like a human scale, not these bigger facilities. So.
The ones that I've seen around are not huge. And so I'm wondering whether the business itself will kind of limit the size, because you wouldn't want to rent space you're not going to use. So, but it seems like storefronts are basically a, very, very small, just a counter and some room in the back. But so I guess I'm not as concerned about the square foot, because I think that the business would regulate itself, I guess.
I don't know how I feel about that, Cindy. It might, but it could not, and I think if we're concerned with having a mega marijuana store, I think we need to address this if we want to avoid that. Hoping it doesn't happen, I don't think is a great strategy.
Well, Sam, I mean, that actually directly speaks to my concern, which is if, a Damon's beverage warehouse wanted to go out on Stillwater or something, I don't think that many of us would bat an eyelash at that. And I don't want to put any restrictions on one particular kind of business, because I think it sends a message that that kind of business is somehow viewed with suspicion or doesn't quite belong, or that there's something. I mean, this is legal, and if the people vote for it, then
sure. But my point was like hoping that it doesn't happen. I mean, if we want to control it, we'll control it. But if we're just going to look at all the other little mom and pop shops out there and hope that's what happens. So that was my only point, is like, if we want to, I understand your point.
And I guess to just clarify, Sam, it wasn't that I was hoping that they, okay. I was just saying that I think the industry is not one that would want a large square space, but
I can't imagine either.
Unless, and I apologize, it's been a long time since I've read this thoroughly, but unless we're combining uses, which I thought we weren't, right. That just retail, I think you're going to find, unless there becomes a, like you say, a Marden's of retail marijuana, I just don't see somebody wanting to get that much square
foot. Do you think Thriftway is a 10,000 square foot building that's out there on Park Street?
I can tell you, just going back to Friend and Friend, a little birdie just told me that Friend and Friend is 12,000 square feet.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think the standard was more put in at the beginning to not so much to as it was a concern that retail space would be too large, but it was to prevent really large dispensaries where you would have bigger grow operations in town when it was the goal of the ordinance to put cultivation further away from the downtown area. So I think that was the initial reason for putting it in there. But yeah, as mentioned, we sort of already have other measures in there taking care of that. So this standard is not as particularly relevant now as it might have been early on in the discussion.
So I agree with Megan that I wouldn't want the 10,000, I don't know if she said this exactly, but I wouldn't want our marijuana ordinance to be more restrictive on what retail size of a retail establishment can be than any other retail establishment. So I wouldn't want to send the message that we're trying to make it more difficult to do a marijuana business than any other business. So if this 10,000 is matching some other maximum that we have, then I'd be supportive. But if it's a unique maximum for retail, then I wouldn't be supportive.
I guess I'd also say that if a liquor store can go in a 10,000 square foot property, then I would not want to, put one against the other.
So do we allow a 10,000, more than 10,000 square foot store right now, retail store?
So the only size limitation would be in the commercial 2 and village commercial. They wouldn't be allowed to be more than 15,000 square feet for a new building. There are
How
no
about for
other,
existing buildings?
sorry, what was that?
And for existing buildings, they can be over 15?
I believe that's how the ordinance is worded. I'm pretty sure it specifies that it's just new buildings.
It does.
Because I think it's less use specific, more so again, trying to create a sort of design standard and for the actual structures for those districts.
I'm just going to pop in to say that, Cheryl, you have eagle eyes because Thriftway is 9,000 square feet.
So I'll just point out one more thing. So marijuana retail stores, according to this, would be allowed in the commercial 2 and commercial 1. So if you got rid of this standard, any new construction marijuana retail store that went into the commercial 2 would still follow the existing design standards of our ordinance. So that 15,000 square foot maximum would still apply to any marijuana retail store. It wouldn't apply to marijuana retail stores in the commercial 1 district. But the design standards of the ordinance aren't as concerned with keeping that smaller scale form in the commercial 1 as it is with that kind of feel in the commercial 2 on Park Street and Village Commercial.
Ready to go to the next comment?
Is there anything else on this, or I guess, Kyle, what are you looking for from us for this?
And so, like I said, I think it's fairly harmless, I think, to remove that standard entirely if people aren't, if there isn't a desire to single out marijuana establishments and regulate the size that they're allowed to operate at. If there isn't a desire to do that, then I don't think there's a lot of harm or impact that would be had from just removing the standard entirely.
I think that if the purpose, which I think I'm hearing you say, the purpose of the number of the 10,000 number is limiting the grow operation that could be connected with that business, then I think that's a perfectly reasonable limitation to have in there, because that is something that you might desire in the village commercial or the CD2. I mean, that was really my only curiosity.
I guess I don't have any problem leaving it with the 10,000.
Okay.
I don't think I want to reduce it, but I think the 10th, I mean, you know, I just don't want to pick a random number either, you know, go, oh, 8,000 or 5,000. It seems random to me without a good reason.
How would you feel, Cindy, about just leaving it off?
That works fine for me too. It just seems like that's counter to what Tom is trying to say here.
I guess the argument for not leaving it off would just be, I mean, I get, maybe that's not a good argument. I was going to say, like, in the C2, if it were going to, you know, potentially fit into the neighborhood where there is a thriftway that is that particular size, then maybe you wouldn't want something bigger. But then if a different kind of business could be bigger, I don't know if that makes it fair. Poor Tom, he put this suggestion in and now we're taking it in the opposite direction.
I think it is, with all the work that we're doing to make the village commercial more walkable, it seems to me that the larger storefronts, the larger size of the structures, we're kind of defeating that. Am I right, Kyle? Or I'm not a planner. I don't even play one on TV.
But if I'm reading the chart correctly, marijuana retail stores are only allowed in the C1 and C2 district, not the village commercial district.
Gotcha. Never mind then. I disregard.
Okay. So they can't be downtown in any way, shape, or form.
Right. It is the same concept as the commercial too, though. I mean, that there's a lot of work in the comp plan and, you know, ordinance changes that we've made to make the commercial too, specifically along Park Street, a more walkable corridor with, you know, smaller storefronts and, you know, buildings closer to the street. So it is the goal in that area to not have, you know, enormous structures or facilities. But yeah, again, the ordinance, the existing ordinance language already limits that area to 15,000 square foot for new buildings. So that aspect of it is sort of already captured by our ordinance.
This may have been mentioned before I signed in tonight. Sorry, I was late, by the way. But when you mentioned C2, that is only referring to, it's limited to the full C2, the regular C2, not like any of the extra little zoning additions.
Right.
So just along Park Street.
Yeah, there's the footnote under the table in the ordinance specifies that it's, yeah, just that portion of the commercial 2 on Park Street.
Indeed, I saw that. I just wanted to make sure that was mentioned for anyone at home listening.
And Kyle, is this part of a state? This is not part of a state standard, correct?
No,
The
not
state
this part.
recommends. Okay.
I mean, in different ordinances, I remember, I mean, these sorts of square footage standards usually come into play with the idea of form-based zoning, where you have a certain zoning district meant for a certain purpose, and you want to kind of regulate the feel and the look of that district. You want to, you know, have some control over the scale of the district. And as you know, we want to maintain a certain feel, you know, as you get more in town, that more kind of small scale, neighborly feel, less, you know, larger scale commercial and industrial. That's why you start to see those types of standards come into play. But yeah, since cultivation facilities would not be allowed in the commercial 2 anyway, there isn't really a risk of a dispensary that would be a retail store and cultivation going into the commercial 2. Our ordinance would already require that the cultivation aspect of the dispensary, it either wouldn't be allowed in the C2, or they'd have to locate their cultivation area to a district that did allow cultivation.
So the 10,000 square feet is not necessary to limit the size of the grow operation or cultivation?
Correct.
Oh,
Correct.
okay.
I think at the beginning, I put it in that way as an option to do so, not knowing exactly how everything was going to get fleshed out. But the fact that we're saying that, you know, a cult, I think it's, where is it? All the registered caregivers and medical marijuana dispensaries shall only cultivate marijuana as a cultivation facility as defined in this ordinance, which is allowable use only in the F&A, commercial 1, and economic development zone. So if a dispensary, which is, you know, both a store and you know, they have a cultivation area of some scale, if they wanted to go into the commercial 2, their cultivation area, we've defined it in our ordinance to consider that a cultivation facility, which is its own land use and wouldn't be allowed in the C2. So if they wanted to do that in the C1, where both commercial cultivation and retail facilities are allowed, they would be able to do that in the C1, but not in the C2.
I think I'm leaning toward if the ordinance says 15,000 square feet, I think I'm leaning toward just working with within our ordinance, it's already there, and not singling out the marijuana industry for a 10,000 square foot.
Sounds reasonable to me as well. I guess I'm just more sitting here thinking of Tom's question and being puzzled by the 15,000. But that's a whole different question for a different time. But yeah, if there's no pressing reason to have it be 10,000 instead of what's standard in the C2, I don't see why we would impose a different standard.
Anyone else have any opinion one way or the other?
Yeah, I'm kind of like just been absorbing all the comments. I agree that I don't want to set a standard based on, I mean, this is obviously an item that's going to be driven based on a belief and not what's fair and equitable for a business owner. So I want to make sure that when we do these things, that it's fair across the board, regardless of what feelings may be or of what people may think. So I'm on board with kind of leaving with what we currently have.
I'm fine with that myself. And I think the design standards, you know, really kind of limit what can go in. So I'm good with going up to the 15,000. Sophie, just as a point of clarification, we're going to vote this ordinance as being final for referendum?
So the process, which is on the next slide. So do you want to finish the ventilation question that Tom had first, and then we could talk about the process?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so yeah, Tom's last point was just on one of the standards for ventilation for each of the facilities. The wording in the ordinance was all marijuana, you know, retail stores, whatever type of establishment, shall be designed or equipped to prevent the detection of marijuana odors from the property line. So, Tom had brought up, should that be an and instead? I guess the reason for the or was that there may be, the odor issue, the ventilation issue is less of an issue in certain types of establishments than others. Cultivation has more of an odor concern, I think, than a retail store might. So they might oftentimes require more actual equipment, whereas a retail store might be able to get by without an actual filtration system, but just kind of designing the layout of the property so that it's not impacting the surrounding area. So I think that was the reason for the or, but again, obviously open for discussion.
I just wonder if what he's trying to get at is not only do they have to be designed, but they have to meet that design. And so I think it might be more of a question of, in the ordinance, when we say something has to be designed a certain way, do we mean, Kyle, that not only does it have to be designed that way on paper, but it has to work as designed?
Right, and then take that, yeah, that makes sense to me.
We ready to move on?
I think so.
Well, I would if I didn't just freeze. So the next step is going to be to have, so once council has language they're happy with, the next step would be to schedule a public hearing, and you do that at a council meeting. We usually call it on consent. Where this is such a closely followed item, I would suggest that we do it as an order so that there can be discussion at that point. Once the public hearing is held, the council will go through the regular process, and I think you'd be asking people for comment on two things. The first thing being the language in the ordinance, and the second thing being whether or not it gets sent out to referendum, because those are really the two things that you're grappling with. Once you have a public hearing, I'm assuming you would get comments. You would send it back to workshop, and you'd go through the comments as you always do. If there were no major revisions to the ordinance, the next month, where it would normally be an order approving an ordinance, the order would simply be sending the ordinance out to referendum on a specific date. If when you went through your workshop and you decided to make some major changes to the ordinance based on what you've heard, depending on how much change is made, that might have to go back out to another public hearing. And you just kind of start the process again, which is why we are recommending that we have the public hearing in either call it in September for October, or call it in August for September. So that there is plenty of time if you need to revise, because it would have to be ready to go on a ballot by, I want to say, the end of December, in order to meet the March election timeline. Is that helpful?
I feel like there's been a significant amount of work on this, and that I'm ready to schedule a public hearing for September. I feel like we're ready.
Yep, I agree with you. The only thing I'm wondering is sometimes we don't have an August meeting, but if that's the case, we could move it to October, but chances are we'll have an August meeting. And I think that when we are opening this up for a public hearing, in terms of things that the public might want to hear in the brief kind of overview ahead of that, is that I think that it can be easy to get lost in the language of an ordinance, and it is a topic that people have a lot of very strong feelings about. And I think that what would be most helpful for the public to make comment on this would be to really understand what the language of this ordinance would make life like on the ground in Orono. Like what would Park Street look like with an establishment on it, or what kind of design standards would be allowed, or what would it feel like for this to be in my town, essentially, I think is the thing that would, for me, elicit the most helpful public comment. In terms of, I really don't want it to turn into another debate about whether marijuana should be legal in Maine, which is kind of where we ended up last time that we took in feedback. So to focus people's attention on the ordinance itself, I think it could be really helpful to kind of bring it home to them in a way.
Yeah, I agree. And I also know that we are really looking at an opt-in vote as well. So if the town doesn't opt in, we don't have, we're back to either day one, or just dropping it until they're ready to opt in. Correct? Is that what we're looking at?
Correct.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, in the sense of, if they don't vote, if we go to referendum and they don't vote the ordinance in, then we've essentially not opted in. Anyone else have any questions, comments about the next steps? All right, we will move this all forward and move on to, thank you, Kyle, very much for all your work.
Yep, right.
We are moving on to the discussion of the FY21 Council Work Plan. Sophie, are you gonna do a little of that?
I tried to make some slides to set you up. So you've met about the council work plan once, and you sent Cindy and I with some direction, and I think we've tried to pull it back together into the document that I have shared with folks. I wanted to just start, because when we talk about the council work plan, I've noticed that as we get people more engaged in what we do, which is a wonderful thing, that a lot of people don't understand the structure of our government, and the fact that a town council work plan is not a town government work plan, that departments will still have their own plans. I have my own management plan. This is truly about council thinking about what is its priorities around its vision, and its overarching policies and projects will be coming through the coming year. Hope I've said that okay. So this year, as I understand it, and I've listed them as I understand are the priorities in terms of level of importance, that the first thing is to keep town government going. So the policies and the fiduciary oversight that is key for council as you sit as a body. Second was planning for long-term financial sustainability. So we were looking in that around developing a 25-year capital infrastructure and facilities plan, reviewing municipal service levels in the context of our ability to financially support them, and also looking at the WPCF rate structure for operations and capital planning. That's quite an undertaking right there. Then there are a myriad of council projects, which I'll get into. And then there are FY20 work plan items that are already in the pipeline, meaning staff does a lot of work to get things ready for council's discussion. We've got a lot of work that's already in the pipeline that council really wanted us to focus on finishing. Does that seem that I've hit the priorities the way they were described? Yes, no?
Yes.
Well, actually, my thought is that one of our charges as a council is to, as you have highlighted here, with that one of our charges is policy and financial oversight for operations in a long-term view, and same with planning for financial stability, long-term view. I would prefer to see us have number 3, instead of being special council projects, would be again that we would have a long-term view on how we are doing in meeting the needs of our constituents, of the people in our community, and we know that we are a government that's built in a system that was built on racism and taking property from other people and taking labor from other people. And because that is our history, that one of the things that we would want to do long term is make sure that we're reviewing each step of the way, and that we are doing our best to disconnect from the ways in which we are dragging that history along with us. And so I have been a proponent for now 2.5 years. I've been suggesting that we have some kind of mechanism in which we look at that long term on how we can make sure that we are meeting our goals to be the more ethical, more just as a community, because that's not a day-to-day thing, and it's very hard to do. It takes a lot of a vision, just like it takes vision to plan for infrastructure and making sure that we're following a long-term plan to meet our short-term goals of having better infrastructure. So I like the idea that we get, as council, we have special projects that are important to one or the other of the council members. However, those should be, I think all of our projects should be under this rubric of that we have a charge of looking for the long term and making Orono better. And this is one of the ways I think that we need to work on making Orono better.
Obviously, I agree with everything you're saying in principle, but I think that if you read the language of the work plan itself under specific town council special projects initiatives, they don't all fit into that category. It seems like you're centering this initiative as council special projects, but the list of them, if you look, includes marijuana opt-in, and includes fluoridation of the water supply. It includes government speech and decreasing Orono's environmental footprint. I mean, there's a lot of council special projects doesn't mean exactly what I think you're saying it means, or at least that's not what the document that we've drafted does not reflect what you're saying. So in order to include all of these things, then we might need a broader term like special council projects or initiatives.
Right. Okay. So I'm just saying that of these 4 things, that I felt like there was one missing, and we either then add a 5th, or and personally, I would like to see it up higher in the list. So that's why I focus on the 3. Not that I want to replace special council projects, but special council projects ends up being a catch-all when I still think that we have an overarching goal that hasn't been addressed. And I think I salute Cheryl in the special project of having an environment committee that we've all agreed we think that's a great idea. And that committee in itself is looking at a big view, a plan for the long term about how we meet goals that we agree upon as a council, that then the staff would then enact after we've had public comments and input. So in the same way, that's what I'm looking for, something where we get public comments and input on how we can do better. So I guess I'd be proposing a 5th of the instead of these 4 of these bulleted items.
Lori, I'm going to step in here too, because part of the project that we'll do, it's not a day-to-day, it's not it's part of the project is to build in to our town government, through use of speech, to build in these long-term sustainable policies, and that makes it long-term. I mean, that's what it is. And so maybe next year, if we're looking at our work plan, what's our plan for long-term, civic sustainability or something like that. But we've got to get off the ground first. And so when we look at these, when it's called special council projects, it's really about conversation, committee meetings. How do we do this as a long-term, kind of situation, or as a long-term policy? and set those goals. So we have to have a starting place. We can't just jump into, number 5, we're going to do this. We've got to have a starting place. And that's where I see our starting place is, right there. And then we can start going, okay, now we've got these policies. How do we sustain them? How do we continue, to advocate for, equality or equity is where I go. I rarely go to equality. But, and then we can figure out, formalizing a plan, those kinds of things. But I think what we're doing this year is we're establishing and we're talking and we're discussing with the public, without the public, however we need to do it. And then we can move into, then we can move into sustainability, or we can build sustainability into it. But we got to have a starting point, and that's kind of where we're at right now this year. So I think we just need to leave it here,
Right.
and then we'll go, and then after we've got established and we start writing policy and we start thinking about these things from lots of perspectives, then we can move on to, how do we, oversight or planning for long-term sustainability,
Well,
which we will do anyway.
This slide shortens up the actual name, which is specific town council special projects / initiatives. Could we just make it long-term initiatives? Because several of these, fluoridation in the water, if the referendum is changing it, that's a long-term effect on, and marijuana is a long-term, will have a long-term effect. So I think a lot of these things already are starting a much longer, broader discussion. So maybe we could just change it to long-term initiatives.
So I'm not talking about demoting special counsel projects. I did say that I have been talking about, when I first introduced it 2.5 years ago, I called it that I would like to have a civil rights committee, but whether that's actually what it's called or not, my proposal then, and I would reiterate now, is that we would have a way in which we looked at this big picture issue. And Cheryl, I was actually supporting that you have created and encouraged us to create a committee about this environment committee that's looking at this big picture issue. It's not our job as counselors to get into the weeds of the day-to-day. That's the job of our staff. It's our job to look at the big picture. And I think that fluoridation, that's a big picture issue that affects our town. And there's many things that were listed under special counsel projects. I did not see this thing that I'm talking about. And as long as it wasn't anywhere, I just started my proposal with how do we bring it all the way up to being a number 5 bullet. Obviously, no one else said, yay, Lori, let's make it a number 5 bullet. So I'm perfectly happy to have it go under the number 3 bullet of special counsel projects. When I looked at this work plan, I saw the discussion about the police, but I didn't see this bigger picture thing that I had described, which wasn't specifically about this police, but how we might learn how to not navel gazing, but self-evaluate our whole town government and to figure out how we are doing. And the way to do that, to take our own pulse, is to assign some time and some community members to do that. More expensively behind staff, but they don't have the expertise to do that. And I don't know what we would learn, and so I'm not even proposing any policies or procedures. I'm just saying that I think that's part of our job.
Can I just take a pause here, because it troubles me, and I'm sure that it troubles other people on council, that there's this constant bringing up of, well, I'm doing this and everyone's not doing that. And here's the reality of the situation. Letter H is the language that Cindy drafted and added to number 3 on this work plan, which is develop a plan through a series of community discussions to promote racial justice and equality. And the reason that she drafted that language was because we don't have, when Cheryl came to council with her environmental committee proposal, it was thorough, it was detailed, there were specific goals that committee was trying to accomplish. And I would love to see that from you, Lori. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, 2.5 years later, we have other initiatives that other counselors have put forward and that we've put on the work plan and that we are working on it, because all of us care about this issue. And I'm very tired of having this kind of us versus them mentality when we have these conversations. We are all working towards a common goal, and we are all trying to contribute to the conversation. And I'm sorry if it's not exactly the way that you would like it, but my suggestion to you is you could put more meat into your proposal, and then we could talk about it, and then we could do something. In the meantime, other people are putting forward other proposals. And so I look forward to hearing a specific proposal from you. In the meantime, we have other things on this agenda that are related to those issues that we will be working on in the upcoming year.
Yeah, and I do believe D and H start the conversation. So I think we can get to Lori's issues, but once we get some more information from the community and some education along these different lines. But, is there anything else that anyone wants to add to, or Sophie, do you have any more slides? Another slide.
I do. I actually thought this would be this was just to kick off to show you the buckets. I was going to get into the buckets, but you guys might just wave me through. So the policy and fiduciary oversight is really about the things that come up. Most of this is either driven from staff, our consultants, or the community. And it's around, we have grants, we have, you know, things that kind of drop in our lap that aren't part of anybody's work plan. That is there. The other piece is that our voluminous ordinances also make it very clear that council has a lot of oversight with regard to how we spend money in our stewardship. And you can't, I mean, regardless of how busy we get with other things, we've got to weave that in to make sure that we can keep government going. I've talked a little bit about what that long-term financial planning was going to look like. So, Megan, I think you talked about the, you already kind of gave the laundry list of the special projects, and these are things that the entire council has agreed to put on the work plan. So they're not a one, like somebody has an idea and it just goes there. And you'll notice on the last one, I reverted to old language for Cindy's piece. I need to pull it back out and put the new language from today in there about developing a plan, but I can update that easy. And when we talk about finishing the items on last year's budget, last year's work plan, we're talking about the ordinance amendment on solar installations. We're talking about the fact that we're in major flux on solid waste disposal, and our ordinances are still looking at a previous environment where none of those avenues are the same, but we're not ready to adopt new ordinances yet because we haven't figured out exactly where we need to go with that. We have talked at length at Finance and Operations Committee about the fact that we have developed a culture and expectations in the police department based on best practices that live in standard operating procedures, and we've already started the process of developing the ordinance to make that council decision as opposed to police chief or town manager decision, which we felt was really important. We wanted to improve our pedestrian safety and really the safety of the entire traveling public. The meat of that this year is going to be working with staff to develop the scope for the Main Street sidewalk project. It is likely that our desires are going to far outweigh our pocketbooks, and so we're really going to need to figure out how to make that work. We've been talking about developing an official map that shows all of our future connections, including pedestrian connections. That's really important, especially as people want to develop more, for people to understand where we're looking to link roads together or where we're looking to have a pedestrian trail and what that might look like. We've talked a lot about wanting to attract families to Orono by encouraging the availability of affordable housing. So the three things we have on the plate right now are three pretty significant zoning changes. The implementation of a village commercial transitional overlay district, the implementation of a village residential overlay district, and the reduction of the MDR zoning district minimum lot size. So all of those three things together would increase density and allow for smaller buildings to be built, which should make it more affordable, and for existing buildings to be divided if that works. We also want to address safety and social concerns related to rental properties. And I think when the comp plan was first adopted, that was really aimed at the student homes in neighborhoods. And through the last few years, other issues have come up, like homestays and Airbnb and so short-term rental versus long-term rental. And we were trying to adopt ordinances that would look at bits and pieces, and they were conflicting with each other because council clearly doesn't have a cohesive view right now of rentals and how it wants to regulate that. So that's going to be a pretty big piece of work for the comp plan committee in the coming year, is looking at those rental properties and how we want to or don't want to regulate them. And then the last one is to continue to our work to utilize our outdoor recreational opportunities to encourage people to live, work, and play in Orono. And we're doing a lot of that through the trails, participating in the regional trail network, and also looking at plans to improve or construct some recreation, open space, and amenities, including playgrounds, Councilor Kuntz. So one of the questions that people might have is kind of, how does this happen? And the town council has three standing committees, a pretty long comp plan implementation committee is an ad hoc committee, but it's been around for a while and still has a considerable body of work ahead of it. And then the newly implemented environment committee, which is a special ad hoc committee that has a 1-year charge right now, that when that charge is complete might come back and be folded in as another more standard committee. So council meets in 3 different ways. It meets as a full town council with orders and doing the business of the day, taking votes and moving things along. It meets in workshop, which is what this is, where you all talk, usually a lot, because you're trying to get to an agreement or a consensus on kind of a compromise. And then the last would be in committee, which committee is the most informal place that we meet, in smaller groups, usually with staff or members of the community, to help you work through the preliminary planning that then can come back to the town council. So,
Sophie,
yeah.
go ahead. I'm sorry, I have a question about this slide, so when you're ready to move on, I'll wait. I'll ask.
So I just wanted folks to understand that what was 4 slides before is a lot of work, because here we're starting to kind of flesh out some of the tasks. But for example, if we got those 3 zoning district changes made, we might then identify, the comp plan committee might identify something else it wants to work on to try to move that goal forward. That the goal is really the priority, and how we move it forward is kind of like, here's what's ahead of us today, but if we got it all done, you'd look for more. So I went through 4, 5, maybe 6 slides to just lay out what those tasks are. And I don't know if you want to take time to go through those or not today.
Can I just ask, can you elaborate just a little bit on educational opportunities to understand Orono's history and how it impacts?
I probably take that, Cheryl.
Okay.
We're going to try and invite the Penobscot Nation to come in to talk to us about Chief Orono and and then from there develop our plan on how to market Orono. But if we have a good understanding of our history, we can respect it moving forward type idea.
Perfect. Thank you, Cindy.
Sophie, just because we have a couple of things that are pretty big coming up after the work plan, unless someone has a specific question, I would kind of not like to go through each individual one at this point.
But also to note to the public that we make our work plan available to them, so they can look at it and ask us questions anytime.
Yep.
I'll actually go ahead and you would be slated to adopt the work plan. You've actually started doing that formal step. I think you started it last year. So we would have you adopt it, and then we'll post it right on the website so people don't even have to ask.
Sounds like a plan. So I guess at this point, if someone has an issue with the wording or, thinks we missed something, if you could just send it along to me, I will, get with Sophie to change it before we go to the full hearing on it. But, there's nothing more on the work plan. I'd like to move on to number 4. Josh is at home in his backyard. Is that a pool in your backyard? You're on mute.
On mute. It isn't, but it will be next year.
Oh, okay. So I'm not sure if Sophie had a plan for this. I was kind of thinking a little bit as to maybe we could just quickly go through counselors and just find out what they think the goal is that they would like to get out of a community hearing session. So then we can morph that into some sort of look. So Megan, because you brought up the listening sessions, I'll put you on the hot seat first.
Okay. Well, the way that this idea came about for me was really attending the gathering at MLK Plaza a few months ago, where I did speak a little bit. People were sharing about their different sort of feelings about George Floyd and what was going on in the world with policing and police brutality issues. And I had been speaking a little bit about Orono's community policing efforts and the training and the certifications that our police force have. And some members of the community spoke and said, well, yeah, that is mostly true, but also I've had this experience, or my friend had that experience. And after that, I went up to those people and just had long conversations with them, because there's no way that I can know what it's like to interact with police in my community as anyone other than myself. So I wanted to hear more, because I can't make decisions as a counselor unless I understand the experience of everyone in the community. And so that got me thinking about how we needed a larger scale mechanism to do that, apart from individual counselors talking to individual residents, or waiting until sort of a problem came up or someone came to council with something. So I want to do it in a, I think the goal for me is to do it in a way that is not re-traumatizing anyone, but giving people space to share their experiences whatever that experience might be about their interaction, with police in our area, mostly so that we can understand what other people's experience is, and also so that we can talk more about, what our goals are, what our, overarching policy positions are. There are a lot of things that people might not know about how we view policing in our community as a council and as a town government. So my feeling is that the first step to moving forward to fixing problems is to really listen to people to find out what those problems might be, because everyone has blind spots. So for me, that was really the major thing I would hope to get out of this.
When I hear about this, my immediate thought goes to circles, like listening circles. And a lot of it is about healing. And when I think about that, when you said, I can't remember what you said, Megan, but it's about healing either past wounds, or having people have a chance to talk about what has happened to them in a facilitated, a trained facilitator kind of way, collecting information for us. And then as we move forward in a more thoughtful and considerate way in our community. And it's not about it, again, it's not about us versus them. It's about how do we heal if something has happened. And it goes both ways. It's also police too. It's also, things have happened to them, and this environment that we're in right now has got to be incredibly hurtful, I would think, if you have chosen to be a police officer and you're, and this is your profession, and everything that's going on. And how do we really think about that in a very thoughtful and considerate way? And how does it impact and how does it affect policy that we have here in Orono? So it's an information gathering session for me, but it's also about people and our community, and being very conscientious about what we do and how we do it.
I think I agree with what's been said so far, and also in past discussions. But it's also, like Megan said, it's just the old adage, seek first to understand, then be understood. I think this is a chance to hear from the public what their concerns are. I think that's really important, because a lot of times you have, you'll have groups say things or experience things or feel things, and then, but this is a chance for it all to come together. But also it's a chance for Josh and the team to really explain what we do for training and how we do that. And also bear in mind, we all know that we have our policies and we have the way we want things to be run, but then every department consists of a bunch of individuals too. So what do we do to make sure everybody stays on the same page? It's just like, let's all the cards on the table. Where are we? We understand this is a really difficult time. And nationally, when you look at it, it's a crazy. And also, looking back, systemic, behavior over decades and decades and decades, centuries actually. But so there's a lot of passion here. There's a lot of real. There's a lot of emotion behind all this, and I think and I love that Megan brought this up as a possible way of, just as a point to start, let's all talk about where we are, what our experiences are, and listen to each other, and listen to the public, listen to the police, I think we just we really need to take the lid off this and air it out. And what's the next step? Is it a new committee? I have no idea. But right now we need to start exactly where we are, and then we need everybody to buy in on that, and everybody to contribute, and then we can establish the next things. I'm not going to say, well, yeah, next year we're going to have this structure or whatever. I mean, it's like we need to figure out what we are, and then together I think we need to identify what the next step is to moving forward with this.
Gary or Lori?
We had a comment on our chat that said cultural change should not be siloed into the police department. So, and I think that it's wonderful to hear specific comments. You learn a lot when you hear from our constituents about their experiences. I don't want to downplay the importance of that. However, we can also learn by doing a lot of reading and looking at the statistics that have been gathered across the country about the experience of people and the experience of how policing has become in our country, and what the percentage of our budget is used on policing, and what our overarching goals are for the town, that may not be exactly how we want to use the cash that we have. And individual experiences that have happened to specific people, they may not be willing to come forward in a forum where there's a lot of people in power, we're all white folks. Even if we're very interested in hearing their testimony, they may not feel like it's a very safe space. And so I salute the idea of gathering information and listening to people's testimony. And yet I'm concerned that it's not going to be that fruitful, because the people who have maybe something that will educate us the most about how the system did or did not work for them may not be comfortable coming forward. And so much as we had a great idea, which is we're going to put money in the community because it was COVID-19, and we made these loans available, and it turns out we missed the mark because no one took the money. No one took the loans. And I'm a little concerned that this may not be the best way for us to get the information we're looking for, because we may not be able to get the information from the way in which this proposed committee is would be enacted.
Can I step in for a second?
No.
If we do listening circles, there's a lot of prep work that goes into it beforehand to make sure that people feel safe. So it's not just a meet and greet and, everybody air their differences. It's important that people feel safe, because if they don't feel safe, there is no healing. And it's important that people understand what the process is and why it's necessary. And a hired trained facilitator manages the emotions, is very objective, does not have a stake in the game at all, and does this consultation for a living. So there is some prep work that goes into it.
Cheryl, at this point, I'd like to just kind of get everybody's objectives and goals out, and then we can specify. So I think we let Terry.
Yeah. Boy, I can tell you, well, first of all, I think this is a good start. I think it's important to say that we're doing these things just to kind of put it out there. I don't think it's safe or fair to say that it wouldn't work when we haven't tried it yet. I will say on the front end of this, it was a little bit different for me when this all became, front and center. And on a little bit of a level, I felt bad for Josh. And the reason why I felt bad was because there was this broad stroke of a brush that went completely over America. The assumption was that every single person within the law enforcement were wrong. And I would hate to be in a profession, even in my world, that I'd have to bear that when it's not particularly true for me. But it's front and center. I think that these things are going to be worthwhile, that people are going to have these conversations about what has happened, what's important. I think it's going to be important for our police department to see whether or not were they aware of these things, were these things that were very common. Obviously I live in a different world on council with our law enforcement. So I think this is really a good fresh start. I think Meg, you said it great. It's getting these groups together, having a conversation, and then going from there.
Yeah, I kind of agree with everyone. We'll bring people out and we can kind of talk about the issues. I know people are on a national perspective are very nervous. I'd love to hear that people are not experiencing that in Orono. But I also, from being on council for many, many years, I know that sometimes we hear about something that happened with the police that may be 10 years old, and we have different personnel, we have different policies in place now. And so I'd like to also kind of get that out there to find out if we can, because some stories continually come up and they've been dealt with a very long time ago, and this administration didn't even have anything to do with them at most times. But so I guess
brought that up actually, Cindy, because I think that another benefit of this approach too is that if we can create an environment of trust and where people feel like they really will be listened and heard, that we could perhaps get more, like people would be more comfortable, coming forward if they did have a complaint, which I'm not always sure, might be happening with folks, so that we don't hear, I know one of Josh's frustrations is he might hear, oh, well, 5 years ago, somebody did X, Y, and Z to my friend. And he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'll investigate it, but it was 5 years ago. Like, I want to investigate it. I want to know these things, but why isn't anyone telling me when it happens? So if we can create an environment where people feel more comfortable, expressing complaints when they do come up so that they can be dealt with immediately, that would also be invaluable.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go to Sophie and Josh as to what would you like from us to help you move this forward?
So I will ask Josh to speak in just a minute, but I think it's more about us helping you move it forward. I see this as a council initiative that Josh and I very much want to support, and his team, I think, very much wants to support. We've been invested in community policing for the last 8 years, Josh, 7 years, 8 years, and are quite proud of how far we've come. And I think we're always looking for ways that we can improve and be more accessible to our community. So we're kind of excited about doing this with you. But this is really about policy. And I think Josh and I are approaching this as being able to start a dialogue, being able to get to understand issues or concerns greater, and having people also understand for us. I mean, one of the largest frustrations I've had here is when I hear from somebody in leadership somewhere about something that they heard and never sent the person that told them the story to us when we could do something about it. And so I'm hoping, if I had one goal out of this, is to get the word out how people can engage our police department. And it's just taking that whole philosophy of community policing and taking it one step further. And Josh and I have been to training in the last couple of years about how that model is good for resiliency and safety, period, across the board. So I guess with that, I would pass it along to you, Chief.
Nobody said it, but you all said it, and didn't use the word. It is 100% about relationships. That's the only way that I've ever gotten anything done in my career, is when people trusted me or trusted somebody and knew something, whether they gave us information about a crime that was taking place, or they knew someone was being victimized, or they knew that a problem needed to be solved. If they trusted us, they would come to us. So I can own that while we have tried over the years, it hasn't been an ongoing and sustained attempt to build relationships with the communities of color in Orono. We've done little forays into it at the University of Maine with the international program and with the Multicultural Center, but it hasn't been a concerted, nonstop effort, those efforts have worked in the past with many other issues. Those little efforts have worked in the past with other types of groups. This group, I get it. it's going to need to see, they're going to need to see a much longer sustained, honest, open effort in order to build those relationships, at which point then they can come to us, Megan. They can come to us because they trust us to say, well, I know Chief Ewing, or I know Ed Lesky. I'm going to let them know that my friend just had a bad experience, and maybe we can look into it and get to the bottom of it. And then that will build more trust, and then it'll just flower from there, to which the incoming groups over the years will be told by the outgoing groups, Orono can be trusted, these are the people to go to, and we can just have this ongoing relationship, because it's every time anything ever gets solved, it's about a relationship. So I'm open to anything. I serve at your pleasure. I will never turn you down on anything you want me to do. It's just, it's finding the right way. And I promise you, it's more about personal relationships than anything else. So.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to throw this out there just to start a conversation. But if we're going to do listening sessions, I'm thinking that we probably need to do it for 2 or 3 nights, because some people won't be able to make just a Thursday or a Wednesday. So maybe we should do it a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for, say, about an hour and a half. I would definitely encourage it be facilitated by, not by us, that we're listening. I would also say that I think it might be helpful if we just had a really high level statement about this is what happens when you file a complaint, or and so we kind of have a little bit of a basis so everybody's on the same page. But other than that, anybody want to tweak it or move on to take it in more detail?
One thing that I was thinking, it's not just about, that's part of it. You know, the relationship and being okay with coming forth with the complaint, that sort of thing. But I think, I mean, part of that's earning respect too, and like really being open about what we are doing to acknowledge, you know, our privilege, and acknowledge, you know, like the challenges that are out there, and also what are we doing to educate ourselves? Lori mentioned earlier it's about education too. And it is, and I think that's something we all, not just our police, you know, but I think all of us as counselors, we need to do this too. I mean, it really is on us. So, I mean, I love this. I absolutely agree about relationships. And Josh, I've watched you work since before I was on council, and you know, and so I have incredible respect for you and the department that you have. You know, and now, you know, I mean, it's great. I love watching them bike up through my neighborhood every now and then. It's usually Officer Irish, you know, and you know, and it's just fantastic to see that sort of community outreach. But what are we doing? You know, what are we, you know, and I think we need to say, we understand this and we hear you. I mean, those are powerful words. And so, I mean, I think to really, and to mean it, and really to listen to the concerns that are out there. And maybe they've been generated here in Orono. Maybe they're just concerns that have been packed up by watching so much media about what's the terrible situation this, you know, nationwide right now. But we need to hear them, and I think, and we need to demonstrate we'll do better, and we are open to suggestions. Perhaps we have to weigh it all out, of course, you know, because we have jobs to do. But I think it's the relationships, but it's also, this is what we're doing to move forward and to be better. I think all of us can be better. So.
I just had one question, and thank you, Sam. That's a good reminder. During this virus, so this more logistical kind of question, is it, I mean, are we talking about meeting in person? Are we talking about, what are we talking about here? Or is that something that we can just wait and ferret out as we get going?
I'm begging you to do this in person.
Yeah.
It is not going to have meaning, and they're not going to feel like they're heard, and I'm not going to be able to see, and we're not going to feel emotion. It's going to have to be done in person, even if it's a smaller groups, but I'm begging you, do it in person.
I think you're right. I think in person is, but there's also that fear out there of the virus. So, you know, when we do it, I guess might come into play as well.
I mean, if I had to put aside time to do 15 sessions with only 10 people in the room, it's worth it, I think, for this, you know, for the same reasons Josh is pointing out. I mean, sorry to add to people's calendars, but I think it's worth it to add to our calendars if it means really having a human connection.
I agree.
I hear you too, and I agree. I just you know, when you live with a compromised immune system person and you don't want anything to happen to them, it's hard, and everything is hard right now. So, but I agree, the in-person is way more personal, like Josh says.
Well, one of the things about getting some data from across the country is that we can show our constituents, our citizens, that we are a town whose police force collects data on who the people are that are being stopped. And that wasn't required statewide. And so our town is actually above and beyond what the state requires as far as reporting. And once you have that reporting, that means we can say, we know the people we stop tend to be, you know, there's this many in this age group, this many in this age group, this many that that are from certain populations, whether they're students or whether they're people of color. And that is important information to tell our town that we know how we're doing. And that's part of how our police can do better, is because they can be evaluated when it comes to their annual review of how they're doing. And we can compare, and our police force, I'm sure, compares to the data across the country. And that kind of data, those kinds of data are what help people, our police forces around the country do better. And so besides that, we want to have information from people who would feel comfortable coming forward. I think this idea that we are going to, that this listening session is what we need to do doesn't get at the fact that we can educate ourselves about how we are compared to other towns. And therefore, in that, we might find there's some other town doing something really interesting and we want to do that. But I can say that from what I've learned from our chief and from talking with the head of the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee at the state level, that our town is doing better than other towns. And that's one of the things we want to share with our town. And also, we have such a few number of police officers, and they do turn over. And as was mentioned here, the memory of when someone had an experience that didn't go well, those memories are long, whether it's your own memory or that you heard a story. And so it makes those, that we have a problem be outsized compared to the good that we have done so far and the training that we have. So when I say that I'm not as excited about the listening sessions, it's because I think that there's a big picture on how the police fits into who our town is, and also that question of who do we want our town to be? Because I've heard stories about people who were suicidal, and when a police officer showed up, they kind of would have been better off maybe having a social worker. I've heard stories of people who felt like they didn't have the best interaction with the police officer, and partly it's because they really were not looking for an armed person to come to them. But 911 becomes a concierge service. Like I have a concern, and the cat in the tree, I guess that goes to the fire. So because they have ladders. But I applaud the idea that we're having this discussion, and I also want to applaud that our town is already better than other towns in Maine. And then we have that challenge that we have so few police officers that they might feel burdened that we're pointing at them as not being okay, which is not what my plan is to do at all. I think that we just want to create an environment, as Josh said, about relationships where people feel comfortable coming forward, and that we move forward together.
Josh or Sophie, did Kalia require us to keep some of those statistics?
Yes, yeah, and I continued to do it. We had to, uses of force, warnings, stops, summonses, arrests, hiring, you know, whether they're men and women, the ratios, the not the ages, but the race. So yes, all that data was maintained, and it continues to be maintained or easy enough to compile in a short time.
Is that something council would want to see? Is that something that council would want to put out to public, or is it something we can put out to the public?
I don't see why you couldn't put it out to the public.
Yeah, it can absolutely go out to the public. So my suggestion, Cindy, is I'm watching Josh take a lot of meetings, which is great. He likes to chat with people, but it comes down to him spending time educating people about our policies, our training, our supervision and the oversight pieces within the police department. I think it would make sense. We're going to have to find a facilitator. You're going to have to meet the facilitator because different facilitators are different, and you're going to find the one that works for you for this. But it would make sense to bring Josh in, and Josh and I could talk to you a little bit about kind of that Orono PD 101 around policies, training, supervision, and oversight. Because when people ask you and your answer is, I don't know, that right there is is somebody who could give good information if you had it. The second piece is we're working on Josh's website. There are absolutely things that we can do. One of the things we're doing right now, and he just spent time working with an individual, we're changing the way we report for all town departments in the annual report. And I think some of what we're talking about here, that will be part of it. So I think that council often gets education about different departments. I think now is the time for you to get education about the police department. And I think that we should, I think the way that we can help support this effort is to try to help identify, I think I've got 3 facilitator names at this point, and I think the next step would be for Cindy to meet with them, because one of the pieces is if it's a good facilitator, they're going to get you prepped as much as, and Josh and I prepped as much as facilitate a meeting. It's, if the only thing they want to do is come in and manage 3-hour-long meetings or hour-and-a-half-long meetings, it's probably not the facilitator we would be looking for. So that's my suggestion for kind of a path forward.
I think that's a great idea. And also, I just want to say this. This whole thing, I love the transparency, Josh. I love how you're always open. Absolutely, we can put it out there. This is a ton of work that we are generating for you, and you have embraced it, and you are so willing to do this, and you're such a champion for this. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for the whole department too, for doing this. I know this is going to be a lot of work on everybody's part, but this is important. I think we all get that. But I just want to acknowledge how willing you are to do this, and it just, incredible gratitude. And I'm sure the entire community shares that.
Well said, Sam. So would a next step make sense to schedule a time that we can have Josh come on, maybe have those CALEA reports sent out to us ahead of the meeting? We could talk a little bit about the process and the, what you've been hearing from the people that have come in and talked to you. And I think Sam's got a point too, that we need to be looking at this. It is the police department, but it is, if it's systemic racism that we're talking about, it's council, it's town staff, it's everywhere. So we need to kind of keep that in the back of our mind too, and not just always focus on the police. But so if we could, you and Josh schedule a time for us with that information, and then from there, if council's comfortable with it, after that, we can talk again about where we want to go after that.
Sounds like a plan.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I think I agree with everybody about the in-person session. So maybe as we move this along, the vaccine will come out and we can all meet in person.
And I think one of the things to think about, Cindy, is if we could do it in early enough fall, we might be able to hold something outside. That's what a lot of places are doing. I had a conversation with a group that's getting ready to put up a permanent tent to be able to do some things at night or during the day outside. And so we might just have to get a little creative. I do know that Josh is at his absolute finest when he is dealing with people. And I would very much like to get him out in front of our community for those people, the few that don't know who he is and what to expect when they interact with him. We are very fortunate to have, I think, among the absolute best police chiefs that I know of, not just worked with, but know of. He is incredible, and there is nobody else I'd like to have at the helm with me as we walk through this. So I think we should just let him go and do his thing and help the council get the information that you want and need.
Great. So if we could schedule that education session earlier than later, so that we then can schedule the listening sessions and have time to advertise them, I guess. So anyone else have anything on this topic before we move on? No? Sophie does?
I don't know I have any more on the topic. I have an inquiry asking if there's room for public comment, and I think that's a you decision. I've got probably 15 minutes to 20 minutes with the next thing, and I really want to get us through it so that we can hopefully begin to make some change.
I'm kind of, unless council has an objection, I'm kind of at this point thinking that we've got a plan to move forward, and but we've got other things on the agenda, so I'd like to kind of move forward. We've read the chat.
That's fine. That was me who I messaged Sophie just to see, because I know we have quite a few people watching this. If we can just sort of like really encourage people, if you have thoughts, if you have concerns about this, if you have things either supporting where we're moving, or if you think you have suggestions how it could be better, please email us, please reach out to us. I know many people on this list, and it's not a shy group, but just a reminder, please do let us share your thoughts, and we all get that, and we all will definitely take that into consideration and read that outreach. So that's it. Thanks.
Yep, thanks, Sam. Okay, Sophie, we'll move on to the general overview of a proposed departmental operational and budgetary restructuring.
So, the way our system is set up, if I'm able to meet the goals of council within the budget that is provided to me by council, and I'm not adding more bodies because more bodies are a cost long-term, it kind of falls within my purview to restructure, whether it be budgets or within a single departmental budget or a department. Having said that, I've done it a few times, and I have never done it without coming back and talking to the town council. So that is why we're here today. Josh and I want to talk to you about a plan that we have that we think meets some operational needs for the police department. And I want to put it into a context for you, because there are three distinct forces at play here. Two of them that I will answer any question that you have about it, and the other one I will tell you is a personnel matter that I cannot speak to publicly. But if I was going to tell a story, I would start about 6 years ago, when Josh and Cindy and I joined with a group of other department heads from town. Dave Mylan and I think Bell was with us. We went over to Durham, New Hampshire, and we were trying to figure out how to deal with some of the conflicts we were seeing between student homes and neighborhoods. And Josh spent a significant amount of time with the chief over there and learned some things that were kind of interesting in the way they had things structured. Over in Durham, they had what they called a POP officer. Josh and I don't particularly like the name because it stands for problem-oriented policing. So let's forget the name, but it's the idea of having somebody who was not the person that was responding to the noise complaint at 2 a.m., but instead, mid-morning or afternoon the next day, would knock on the door and have a conversation with people about what the impact of that noise complaint was on their neighbors. It was about educating and building relationships. It was about reaching out to the business community within the schools, at the university. It allowed them to have a more sustained presence, which is what Josh just talked about. So when we got back from that, we started this grand idea for a community services officer. And it was always with the idea that we would need to add people to make it work. So every year, Josh comes to me with a request to add people onto the police department to make this community services work. And every year I say, I'm sorry, I don't have any money for that. And he says, well, I'm working on it, and goes away. So that has been at the forefront of our priorities for the department, but we've never had the money for it. Then we have what's happening in the world today around law enforcement, and the fact that being more community oriented and really taking that community policing model and taking it the next step makes a lot of sense. And then we had a personnel issue come to the forefront. So which is what has caused us to decide to bring this to you now. What we're suggesting is right now, and Josh, you can interrupt at any moment. Right now, our department is a chief who has a captain. There are 3 sergeants, and then the remaining people are, the remaining 10 people are patrol officers. We have 2 of those patrol officers that are on special assignment. One is a school resource officer and one is a detective. It looks like one big police department on paper that is focused on policing and is all essentially patrol. Our suggestion is that we restructure operationally to have a chief and a captain. Within the collective bargaining unit, we would maintain 3 sergeants. We would have, we would create I call it division just because that's the way our financials break things up, but a division of court services and investigations and a division of community services. Within the division of community services, we would move a community services officer, senior community services officer, who would be kind of running that division. Is that fair, Josh? Running the division? That person's most likely going to be our senior. You want to?
Essentially running the division, but more so in a mentoring role for the secondary community services officer, so that that person learns under their tutelage and could ultimately move into that role and then bring another officer in to then kind of continue that cycle of teaching.
The idea would be that we have 2 officers that are primarily assigned to community services. It would be the knocking on the door where you have a noise complaint. It would be working interdisciplinary teams to solve community issues. It would be not being the chief of police who goes and talks to somebody, but rather somebody more operational, which might make it a little bit easier and more sustainable. It's also maintaining a school resource officer at RSU 26. Whether that is the name or not is different, but or up for discussion. But the idea that it's about prevention and education and relationship building, this would be where we would have a sustained, positive, community-oriented message going out on social media and the website and really making a sustained effort with the community. It also frees up a little bit more of our captain and our chief's time to be able to focus on the supervision and the oversight and the policies, which they all do a great job with, but it's kind of depending on what is the highest priority at that moment for Josh. So our plan would be to move 2 people into this community services division, and to have the second person, the non-senior person, would likely work a shift that would look like, what did we say, Josh? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday days, and Saturday overnights. Is
Right.
that what we were?
We would have an open shift on overnights that we would need to fill. And rather than continue to take away other people's weekends when they finally get weekends off, this officer would fill 3 days during the week, whatever kind of works the best for our needs. And then that, when school is in session, that overnight on Saturdays, or some semblance of that time frame during a Saturday night when we need an extra person. And I think the one area you meant to talk about that is the most important area for tonight is these 2 officers would be our direct link to the Multicultural Center on campus, the LGBTQ community on campus, any other, the Muslim community at the Islamic Center, any of those groups that have traditionally been not as privileged as the rest of us. We want to have a focus. That way it won't be just a short period of time that we work on building some relationships. It would be an ongoing, that's part of their role. That would be part of their function and a large part of their function to start building those relationships and dragging 1 or 2 other officers at a time to those events and functions and relationship building times. And so that would be a large part of their assignment.
The other thing I would say is that the senior person, this would be their primary focus and might very well turn into a salaried kind of position so that we can have more flexibility with the schedule. This will be another face of the department, which I think is really important. I think the other piece of this is that making this change moves the ability to really look at the different functions of the police department. And it says that community is really important to us and here's how we're gonna manage this. It also sets us up in a structural way to better implement whatever policies or practices, best practices come down the pike from what's happening in the world today and what council is going to hear. We know that we're not going to hear, Orono Police Department, you need to be more tactical. Orono Police Department, you need to be more militaristic. We're not going to hear that. And I think right now we are very blessed to have personnel in place in the right time to build this division and to help it grow. And you know, when you consider how young our department is in terms of tenure as law enforcement officers, and also maybe a little bit of life experience, having some senior people who are there on a more regular basis is only going to help us mature, grow, and interact with the community. I've been in front of you a few times saying we've got to do things that codify what Josh is bringing to us. This is one of those things. And my vision for this would be to break the budget apart to show those specific divisions so that it's not $1.5 million for policing, but it's showing where that money is really going in a way that people don't need to sit with Josh and I to understand it. So that's kind of what we're thinking. What am I missing, Josh?
Well, I will tell you that every year, and I've said it in that media post, every year I sit in front of everybody during our final yearly meeting, and throughout the year too, when I individually, but I let them know that how much more important it is that they can do, how much more they can get done through compassion and interactions than they'll ever get done through arrests and stops. Right. So some people get it. I can clearly see that some people get it, but our people rotate through shifts. So I might have someone who gets it, or a couple people who get it, that are on day shifts for a while, that kind of add that to their role each shift, and then they go back to nights, and it's just harder to keep a flow going with the people that are interested. And the people who aren't necessarily interested, they still participate in some of the programs that we do, but I don't fault them for not being interested. I'm not going to get 15 people that truly wrap their head around a community involved law enforcement role. Some people want to be cops, and that's okay, because there's reasons to be cops out there. We're having them daily now. There are significant reasons that we need cops, people that know how to enforce the law and keep people safe. So I don't fault some of the people that's what they want to kind of do, and they're good at it. They want to do drug investigations, and they want to stop cars, and they want to take OUIs off the road, and so I'm okay with that. But if I can focus the people that truly can do all those other things, but they're more focused and driven to do the community involved, relationship building, changing people's lives type role, that's what I'd like to do. And reward that a little bit, and allow someone to teach someone else as they're coming into it, and still have a role at the school, and just see that it's another thing that will attract people long-term as well. I think if that's what the kind of policing that they know they want to do, they'll see an opportunity to go into that division and be a part of that type of law enforcement and involvement. When you all folks solve society's issues, and we're not responding to mental health problems and poverty issues and those types of things, you won't need, I'll go away quietly, happily. I'll go away loudly and happily and go mow my lawn for the rest of my life. But I know that we're still called for these things, and we're still going to get called for the 911 calls for the suicidal person. We're still going to get that call. We're the people that are out and doing it. But when we can get to a place where there's a social worker we can bring with us and hand them off, and that social worker can manage the crisis and set them up for an appointment the next day, and we don't have to stay, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. And I've got cops that literally say to me, and I've heard for 20 years we've been told, the police are doing the social work type of job right now, and sorry, my battery's getting low. The police are doing social work, and we're not skilled for that. We're not built for that. So society, solve that issue, please. I'm begging you, and we'll just go do the education and we'll go after bad guys. But this program, I think, will be a great way for us to bridge a gap for a while until you all solve the rest of the problems.
Well, thank you for framing it that way, Josh, because that's one of the frustrations of working, at a municipal level with a very active, engaged body of residents, where it's like we all share the same frustrations, but then there are also limitations to what you can do at the local level when there's so much that needs to be addressed. Everything from how we fund things to what we think of as what policing should be as a society. I mean, there are these top-down issues that we need just real change in before we can see that filter down to the local level. And I like the fact that we can have these suggestions for, okay, but how can we make what's going on within the borders of our town, the kind of community that we all want to live in until all of these larger problems can be better addressed.
And like Meg said, I like that it's within the borders of our town. I'm very much interested in tailoring Orono to Orono. The people who live here, the people who, the police officers who respond to the people who live here, and really just creating a community of inclusion and, and respect. And I think we're on the right track. And I really like that I feel like this is timely. I feel like it's connected to what we've been talking about tonight. And I think if the motive for telling us this tonight is, or is it to ask if this sounds like a good idea? I think it sounds like a good idea, and I would support an initiative to move forward with this.
Yeah, I'm actually also, I think this is actually an amazing idea. We actually, Cheryl, didn't you actually say something about like social needs? And sometimes I mean, if you visualize an individual that's being dealt with and you show up with a uniform on, it's a bit different feeling than, say, somebody who's a community type person. And I also remember as a child and where I grew up was we had something similar to that, and it was the older person. In this case, she was a sheriff for a while, and then ended up kind of taking the community side of it. And there was something about the ability to be able to connect to individuals on a level that you felt like it was your mother. And I think that it would be like, well, we'll use this as an example. Say Josh gets notice that one of the, for lack of a better choice, a fraternity or something like that, or one of those homes, they had some crazy stuff and neighbors were mad. It would be much easier for that individual to go to visit them and sit down and say, boys, did you know what you did last night? As a, with a non-military, the non-police type apparel. And I bet you they would be like going, oh, like, Dad, so sorry, kind of thing. So I'm all on board with this. I think it's appropriate. I think the timing's perfect. And I would get behind this very easily.
Josh, you're weirding me out by seeing two of you. I just got to say that right now, okay?
Oh, you're muted. There we go. So
I just had to use my phone to get back into this. My laptop was dying, so I'm back.
So just from the perspective of if there are major concerns, Josh and I would want to know. If there are not major concerns, so we've already reached out to the labor union because some structural issues in contracts end up in front of the Labor Relations Board, and we wanted to have a conversation about how in-depth this was going to go, and we've all agreed that it doesn't have to happen. This is a relatively minor change, but it will require some change to the labor contract. So if after tonight we leave with the idea that we have general support, which it sounds like we do, my next step is going to be to reach out to the labor union's attorney and start working on the language. Josh has done some really good work on the policy arrangement with the two new divisions. So it shouldn't take a lot of time, but I don't want you to expect to see something next week because I've got to get the legal framework in order to do it.
I think it's a great idea, and I would suggest you move forward. Anyone else have anything on this before we move to the next item and let Josh go have his dinner? No? All right. Thank you, Josh, for everything. And we'll start with a brief town manager report.
So I don't have a lot to report. I will tell you that we have been given an informal heads up from a community member who's not happy with the planning board's decision to approve the Verizon permit to put an antenna in the Methodist Church steeple. So he has given just a heads up that he intends to appeal that. I reached out to Roger Huber, who would be the town attorney for land use issues. And given all of the work that the planning board put into this, he is suggesting a role that is not Verizon, go defend your own appeal if it comes down the line, but rather one of us defending the planning board's action. When you consider how much time and effort that citizen group does, I think they deserve at least the benefit of the defense of their process, and then let Verizon defend the technical aspects of the permit. So that's kind of where we are. But I always like to give you a heads up if there's a potential that we might make it in the news because of a filing at Superior Court. Just to let you know that we're starting to make some decisions around the Healthy Maine grant that we were awarded, about a $40,000 grant. That is going to have to be accepted by the town council. They are allowing us to expend the funds prior to that. So I just want to make you aware that you're going to start to see some things out at Gould's Landing as the result of that grant, even though you won't accept it until August, and the grantors are fine with that. We have a serial Freedom of Access Act requester right now. I think Josh and I are on sixth or seventh request, and there's this kind of, under state law, you don't get charged for FOA requests until staff has put in an hour of time. So you get an hour of time and then copying fees. Well, if we produce it electronically, there's no copying fee. And he's now breaking it down into chunks that would be less than an hour. So I will tell you, my plan is to address that. I've had email conversations with the state ombudsman, who I think is out of the Maine Attorney General's office, because he's not happy with what we're providing and the cost. You want to go through 12 or 15 years of police training records, it's going to cost you a lot of money because we have to go grab it out of storage and find it. So just want to make you aware there, because he's not happy. Want to make you aware that I'm on vacation next week. Very happy about that. I will not be in the area, but I will be available, text, emails, and phone if people need me. And also want to let people know that we have a finance meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. We're going to go over cash flow, an update on the reval project. Going to talk a little bit about fire department staffing. We've got 2 long-term injuries that are causing us to really hemorrhage some overtime. Going to talk about some code enforcement software that was approved, the budget was approved for, an update on foreclosed property, and then talk about money. How can we not be excited to talk about money? We had some great news today. We got our revenue sharing check in, and it got me a memo from Connie, and I was just looking it up because we are, well, it came in about $50,000 higher than we were expecting. So I need to dig into it a little bit. I think part of what helps us is that we're drawing from 2 pots. We're drawing from revenue sharing 1, which everybody gets, and then revenue sharing 2, which is divided amongst service center communities and communities with high mill rates. But we're going to keep tracking this, and we keep waiting to get more from the State Revenue Forecasting Committee, and hopefully we'll be back in touch after my vacation to talk about where we think revenue is going to be. That's all I have.
That was me, Sophie, registering all the cars last week. So
That does it. That totally does it.
Yep. $50,000, pretty close to what I paid. No. Well, with that exciting advertisement for tomorrow's meeting, I'm sure I'll see all of you tomorrow.
I'm not available. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm not.
Not my
As-
committee.
As it was.
So you are not on the committee, so you have a great excuse for not being there.
Oh, I remember, but I got the personal invitation from you a couple of weeks ago too. So
all right. Well, with that, we will adjourn this evening's meeting, and we'll see some of you tomorrow.
thank you,
Have
everybody.
a good week.
Thank you all.
Bye. Have a good night.